Welcome to a CNBC Africa special. My name is Arnold Quizzer, and today we'll be discussing vaccine rollouts and supply chains, especially on the African continent. Now, to give you a little bit of context, as the global rollout of the COVAX vaccines accelerates, the first COVID-19 vaccination campaigns in Africa using COVAX doses began at the beginning of this month. But could more have been done to ensure equitable access for African countries? We are joined by a panel of experts to help us break this down. Now, this panel of experts is led by Ronald Piavicenzi. He's the CEO of the United States Pharmacopoeia. We're also joined by Dr. Bruce Gelling. He is the president of the Global Immunization at the Sabin Vaccine Institute. And Dr. Chizoba Wanodi, she is the country director for Johns Hopkins IVSC. Thank you for joining us, ladies and gentlemen. I want to start with you, Dr. Bruce. Could more have been done to ensure that there's equitable, access to the COVID-19 vaccines?
You're highlighting a huge issue that's a problem globally. In contrast to past outbreaks, and particularly 10 years ago when there was a global influenza pandemic, COVAX was stood up exactly as you mentioned, to try to ensure that there was more equitable access across the world. It's clear that there is a disproportionate distribution in some of the wealthy countries. At least the COVAX has tried in the near term to negotiate with the companies as a pooled procurement so that there is access available everywhere. The problem at the beginning of any pandemic is that the demands are greater than supply, and therefore the needs are everywhere, and trying to balance those needs is clearly an issue. But I will say that the efforts from COVAX have changed that significantly. But as you say, there's clearly still a greater need around the world than there's available supply.
Ronald, bringing you into the conversation, could more have been done?
Yeah, I think that the lack of emphasis on the distribution, you mentioned the supply chain in your opening, I think was an early mistake, but I think it's been mitigated, or it was caused by, of course, the more rapid development of the vaccine than expected. And so I'm not being critical. I just think it's a remarkable achievement for multiple vaccines to have made it through not only discovery, but testing and into emergency authorizations in less than a year. But that has created strains on the supply chain. That rapid production and that rapid approval of multiple vaccines has caused raw material shortages, some of whom raw materials are shared between the different vaccines, creating even more pressure on the supply chains to produce the volumes needed. And then finally, because we're talking about billions and billions of doses, that delivery requires what we call the last 20 feet or the last 10 meters in most of the world, where the delivery occurs, the inoculations occur, where temperature controls are needed. And these last moment access points are quite different in different locations, certainly different countries, but even in different regions of different countries for how that vaccine is being administered. So these are multiple bottlenecks. None of them are catastrophic. None of these bottlenecks are going to prevent vaccinations, but they are causing strains and delays, and that will continue for many, many months to come.
Yeah, but Ronald, I want to stay with you. There's that issue of patent rights, and that case was at the World Trade Organization earlier this week in regards to allowing certain countries that have the potential to produce these vaccines, to get the rights to them, and that has been denied by the Western countries. Now, isn't that a bigger issue?
Yeah, so I think there's three levels. The first, of course, is let's say a pharmaceutical company who has innovated the vaccine and is production. Multiple of those countries, in fact, most of those companies have contracted production with other companies for part of their or even all of their production. For example, the Vaccine Institute, actually quite a few others. A third bar has been that certain companies like Moderna for one of the mRNA vaccines has also opened up production to third parties completely for essentially a similar but not identical vaccine. And then finally, what you're raising is almost a fourth path, which would be a completely different authorization outside the IP structure. So these are all quite different and complicated, but something I'd like to mention, and this is a strain that any of these pads or most of these pads create for a local regulator in a country, is the approval of that vaccine. If it's not the exact same vaccine being authorized already by a stringent authority, it puts a lot of pressure on a regulatory authority to have to do a new and novel approval. Let's say that vaccine is being manufactured and not being shipped to these other countries. That strain for a complex product like a vaccine can be very, very difficult. And this is where I believe that the wealthier countries need to be able to provide assistance to help make these approvals, especially as vaccines are produced for these other markets.
Dr. Gelin, just to piggyback off the question I asked Ronald, when do the Western powers have the ethical or the moral ground, to have some form of empathy for the developing nations in regards to giving them access to these IP rights?
I think the issue, as has been stated by everyone, with a global pandemic, no one is safe anywhere until everyone is safe everywhere. So I think that's really the recognition that if there are outbreaks that continue around the world, that's a huge restriction on mobility around the world. So I think that compels the look beyond borders to ensure that there's immunity everywhere. I'd like to pick up one other point that Ron raised, because I think it's really an important one. That vaccines, as Ron has laid out, are very complex to manufacture. That doesn't mean that they can't be manufactured in many places, but they're very complex. And because of that, we know that historically there have been shortages of vaccines when manufacturers who do it all the time have some issue with their manufacturing, and they have to then fix that. So that said, when we have a new platforms like this, it's going to be critically important that there be that know-how transfer, not just the intellectual property, but the problem-solving abilities that go on day to day in these plants. And I think that's another part that would have to happen as we start to think about that. That's already going on, as Ron mentioned, with some of the other manufacturing, but also to say that just having the recipe isn't going to instantly provide that capability. But back to your other point, you're absolutely right that we do recognize that the pandemic will continue unless there's protection everywhere. And we also have come to learn that the variants are an issue here as well. The variants occur because viruses infect more people, and because viruses make mistakes when they're replicating. That's what creates these variants. So the more people who are infected, the more variants that will emerge, which is another reason why having immunity globally is going to be important to try to tamp all of this down.
I want to bring Dr. Chizoba Wenodi into the conversation. Thank you for making the time to join us. Doctor, we're discussing the need to make the vaccines, they have equitable access for the lesser developed nations. Now, how can we go about that?
I think there are a number of ways we can go about that. First of all, the will has to be there, the global will to support developing countries to build up their capabilities for vaccine manufacturing and even vaccine development. I think we have to start, little by little. First of all, by enabling maybe regional hubs, because we recognize that perhaps not all countries can have their own vaccine manufacturing plants or capabilities. But what we really need to do is to focus on developing regional hubs. So in Africa, you could have 1 or 2 or 3 countries that will be supported to build up that capability to both develop, manufacture, and package vaccines. I think we can start, first of all, with building collaborations in the science. We've seen that with this COVID vaccine, there's a lot of collaborations that has been built among the scientific community in sharing genomic materials, sharing genomic data. I think we can build on that. I know that in Nigeria, for example, within 24 hours of the first case that was identified, the genomic sequence of that particular virus had been constructed and reported. So I think that's a testament to the the willingness to share science, the willingness to collaborate. I believe that there is a responsibility of the developing country governments to invest in the science as well. So invest in our scientific institutions, our universities, to promote scientific research that can yield vaccine science and help us with development. But most importantly, I think the global community, the rich countries, the advanced markets need to support organizations in low and middle income countries. You see, without India being able to manufacture lots of doses at the same time, I don't know where it would have been in terms of access to COVID vaccines. So we need India to be replicated in South Africa, in Nigeria, and other regional hubs that have the capability and the human resource to really ramp up vaccine science development and manufacturing. Thank you.
Yeah, but great that you bring up that point. We were just discussing it with Dr. Gelin and Ronald earlier. If we are to have another India, then with that support has to come in from the West, and it can only happen from a moral perspective. And the West voted heavily against that WTO IP request by South Africa and India. Now, how do you reverse that? How do you change their attitudes from what looks like more profit-oriented to a moral situation?
I think the moral arguments has to continue to be made. The WTO, in response to the efforts by civil society organizations pushing for the TRIPS agreement, I think they need to rethink their stance on that. Particularly in this unique time that we are facing in the world. This is a pandemic. This is a time for us to put aside profit motives and really work together to heal the world, to rescue the world. Because it's not only a moral argument that needs to be made, I have to say, there's also an economic argument that needs to be made. Because if the rest of the world is still battling with the pandemic and a few countries have managed to vaccinate all their populations, what about trade between countries? What about tourism? We know that many developing countries, form a substantial amount of the tourist business for many of the rich countries. So, besides the moral argument to support the tampering down of the pandemic to equip nations to be able to protect themselves, there is also an economic argument to be made for these intellectual properties to be shared, for the know-how to be transferred, for the collaborations to be built, and enable us to have vaccine security. Like Dr. Gelin said, if some countries are not secure, are not vaccinated, then all of us are at risk. Thank you.
Dr. Gelin, just to stay with you there, I just want to tap into your experience, especially as the president of the Global Immunization at the Sabin Vaccine Institute. Building trust around a vaccine and building trust around these particular vaccines seems to still be a very major challenge. How do you go about building trust in the public?
No, it's really quite a challenge. And while we're seeing unprecedented demand and we see the pressures on the currently limited supply, we know that behind that are many people have questions about all of this. And probably the question that most people ask is, how did this happen so quickly? How is it that within a year we could create a vaccine and now have it in distribution when historically we haven't been able to do that with vaccines? I think the part that's missing on that is a recognition that this wasn't invented beginning a year ago. But the basis for this, and I'll just talk about mRNA, but the other technologies equally, mRNA has been in discussions since the 60s about thinking about how we could harness the power of the information built into the coding that's provided to be able to create drugs. So there was a long history of that, of how to use this tech as a new technology for treatment. It was often thought about for cancer treatment. So the mRNA technology has been around for a long time. It's that same principle that was then applied to this situation, in part because we've had experience applying it in past coronaviruses with SARS and MERS. So I think that's an important part of this, because Obviously, it did go quite quickly from the identification of virus to the creation and now distribution of vaccines, but it's got a long history, and it really speaks to investments in science over a long term, investments in technology, and how those can be brought about. But that's only one part of your question, because at the core of your question is about trust. And I think that we have to be honest with people about what we know, what we don't know, and what we're learning, and tell them the facts that we have them. Not everything is known yet. We're going to continue to learn things, and we're going to tell people what we're learning, and that may change what we do. For example, this idea of how we're designing the vaccine trials. Some have one dose, some have two. We're going to continue to learn from that and how we may need to adjust the vaccine schedule. We're now watching the emergence of variants. A year ago, we didn't think that would happen, or at least happen so quickly, because we thought that the way these viruses were constructed, they were less likely to cause this issue. Well, now we're faced with it, and we have to deal with it. So I think the core about trust is transparency, about telling people what we're doing, telling people what we know, being honest about what we don't know, and also trying to get an understanding for people who have some worry about this, trying to think, what is the core question that they have? What is it that they are worried about, and how can we best address that? And who is best positioned to address that? It's going to be a trusted source with good information that's going to be critical to this. It's not one size fits all, which is why it's so important to be listening at a community level to try to understand what is the issue here and how might we help people come to a decision.
Dr. Chinoba, I want to tap into your 27 years of experience as a public health physician. How do we build trust?
I think Dr. Gellen has really said it all. I just want to emphasize the notion that it's not just about the science. There's also politics involved, and we need to pay attention to the politics of distrust. For example, he talked about we need to listen to the people. So we don't just listen to concerns about the fact that the vaccines were developed really quickly. What we're recognizing is that even though a lot of people have those concerns, there are some groups of people that take those concerns to the extreme and leads to hesitancy. So we need to really unpack the reasons why particular groups of people might have higher levels of hesitancy. And that may actually go beyond public health. It may go into politics. So that's one aspect I really want to emphasize. But the most important thing, I believe, is that we know from data that public health and healthcare providers are the most trusted source of information for the public. So the health providers need to be equipped with the information. They need to be equipped with the skills to be able to address people's concerns. And health providers themselves also have concerns. We have to recognize that. And so as we get new information, we need to find efficient and effective ways to pass that information, not just to the people who are digitally connected, because a lot of information is being passed around on social media, on websites and everything, but to get to the community. We need to organize town hall meetings. We need to integrate this into religious gatherings. Religious leaders who, for the most part, get the ear of majority of the population every week. We need to seize those opportunities to listen to the people, hear what their concerns are, have a dialogue with them. So it's not just a one-way conversation. It's not just throwing facts at people, but a dialogue so that we can critically design the solutions. So I think that religious leaders are very, very important, and they should be brought into the fold. They should be championing. They should be equipped with the knowledge and conversing with their congregation.
Ronald, I'll bring you back into the conversation. What lessons can we draw from this pandemic?
Yeah, I think one of the lessons, we can actually go back even further to other medicine shortages or other times when the demand has outstripped medicine supply. Malarial medicines is an ongoing example. When the demand outstrips supply, it opens the door for counterfeits and substandard medicines, and in this case, potentially vaccines. Not even potentially, it's a reality already. The risk is that it could become a growing trouble. And since the conversation is about trust, we're talking mostly about the trust of the vaccine itself. But of course, if some of the vaccines are counterfeit, of course they won't work. And that can erode trust in a very dramatic way. The challenge is vaccines are complicated, as Dr. Gellan stated, and therefore making sure that those vaccines are not substandard is not a simple task. But there are tools that are available for complex analyses and evolving. And at USP, we're helping to produce some simpler tools to at least do early screenings and give those to at the country level, to regulatory authorities, even law enforcement, to be able to find and remove those counterfeits before they reach patients. So I'm mentioning this now, it's more forward-looking to try to prevent this from becoming a substantial reality that can interfere with trust or push patients to maybe be reluctant to receive their vaccines. So it's not a challenge that we can't address, but I do think it's one that will become more and more in the public over the coming months.
Okay. Coming to you, Dr. Gellan, any lessons to draw from this?
Yeah, no, thanks. I wanted to comment on what Ron said. I think it's really important. This has to do with people's trust and confidence in the system, confidence in not just the science and the development, but in those who are recommending the vaccines. People question about motives and the like. But I think it's that is a larger part of it. Ron has laid out one important aspect of that to make sure that the products that find their way to people are the ones that should be, because they're the ones that have been approved by the regulators as having the safety, efficacy, and quality that's needed. But there are other parts of the system, those who, again, the research community, to make sure that the science is done in an unbiased way, the policy community, if you will, those who make recommendations. Again, there's a lot of discussions around those policy tables to lay out any potential conflicts of interest so that all can see that these decisions are made with the least bias possible. And I think those are important parts as well. It's a complex system, but I think that the understanding of the piece of the system, the checks and balances are in it that ensure that at the end, in those last 20 feet that Ron mentioned, that last mile, the products that you get are the products that are going to change your life.
Now, in your closing remarks, are we ready for the next health disaster?
Well, no, I think we're never really ready for a true disaster. But boy, have we learned a lot as a world on what it looks like to have a true global pandemic. I think we have a couple more learnings yet. We're not done. Clearly, we're not done with this pandemic and the vaccination approach. A few things, though, we're coming into the very practical now from I think the theoretical. We mentioned about the delivery of the vaccines. There are toolkits being developed that are as simple as exactly how vaccines are drawn up out of the vial, how many hours vaccine can be held at room temperature, where they are to be drawn and then delivered in a local setting or in a hospital or in different conditions. And these tools, although specific for the COVID vaccines, are easily adaptable in the future. It's one example. The cold chain shipping around the world, billions of doses. Again, we're inventing this for the first time, and yet we won't have to reinvent this another time. So maybe ending on a positive note, we have learned a whole lot that we haven't had a chance to think about yet. And frankly, I haven't either. We're still busy right now working on the pandemic. But it makes me optimistic that we're going to be in a much stronger position in the future.
And Dr. Gellan, in your closing remarks, could we be more ready or more prepared in case of another pandemic?
Arnold, thanks for pulling us together. This has been a great discussion. Thanks for leading it. I want to take a step back. Our focus, and as you see on the screen now, it's about vaccines and the vaccine rollouts and supply chains. But let's take a step back about pandemic preparedness more broadly. We know that this is going to continue to happen. that the interface between the human and the animals is where most of these come from. We estimate that 70% of emerging infectious diseases come from that interface. In a planet that's as mobile as we are and increasingly dense as we are, the density that we have in our big cities and increasing encroachment in rural areas, we're going to see more of this. So we have to be prepared. We've been talking about vaccines, but let's look at the larger system. It starts with the surveillance. Can we detect things early? And now we've seen the importance of genomic surveillance to be able to have systems in place that can tell us what's out there so we can better respond and make those risk assessments. We have to look at our healthcare systems on how well we can take care of people and absorb their capacity. We know that there's been oxygen shortages in African hospitals as well. That's another part of that. So we have to pay attention to that as well. We've talked about vaccines, and I think we've covered that well, and the importance of greater capacity and more equity. We need to think about treatments as well. On vaccines, the one last point I'd like to make is that we can think through how we can maybe have the vaccines we need before these come. We've in pandemic influenza, we've talked about a universal vaccine. So we don't have to wait for the virus to emerge to have a vaccine that's already available. The same conversation we're having now with coronaviruses, so we won't be chasing a virus with a vaccine. But I think probably importantly, what we've learned in every country and around the world is the critical importance of clear communication, the transparency of what we're doing and what we know, what we don't know, but the importance of clear communication. Because once the communication becomes fuzzy, then you have these issues of trust and people don't know who to listen to or what to do. So I think we can learn from that. We already learned, we're going to learn today. We don't have to wait for the next pandemic to solve that problem, but there are a lot of elements to this, and they all have to work well to make sure that we're prepared.
Thank you for those remarks, Dr. Gelin. Thank you to our panel of experts, ladies and gentlemen. Ronald T. Piavicenzi, he's the CEO of USP. We also had Dr. Chizoba Wonodi. She is the country director of Johns Hopkins IVAC, and Dr. Bruce Gelin, the president of the Global Immunization at the Sabin Vaccine Institute. This conversation was on vaccines and supply chains and redistribution and lessons to draw from this. Now, if you want to be part of it, you can tweet us at CNBC Africa, or you could tag us directly at The Real Quizera. Have a great rest of your day.